Ian Riley, thank you very much for joining us today as the CEO of the World Cement Association. We're very glad to have you on the Captains of Cement and Concrete Lead series. I'd like to get straight into it and ask you your perspective on navigating these unusual times for the cement and concrete industry globally, specifically referring to COVID-19 and how it's affected businesses.
So Tracy, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to talk to you today. So as you said, I'm CEO of the World Cement Association. We have members around the world, and we keep in touch with them about what's going on in their own situations with COVID. And I suppose that there's quite a bit of difference across different countries, but also there's some similarities. So there have been some countries that have been particularly hard hit, and some countries that have escaped with very little impact. But I think as a sort of general rule, there's been about a 15 to 20% reduction in 2020 demand versus the expectations that companies had prior to COVID. So we've seen some cases, for example, in the Gulf, in the UAE and so on, where it's a much more serious problem than that. And I think that's been because migrant labor is used extensively in construction. And so restarting construction is more difficult than it normally is. And in China, we'll probably see no impact from COVID. In fact, possibly even a positive impact from COVID on this year's demand.
That's right.
So it does range quite a lot. But I think in most countries, the sort of 15 to 20% seems to be where they've ended up. And I think when we look forward to what are the problems and what are the challenges going forward, then as we come out of the lockdowns and the various restrictions, there's a question of how the market reacts to that. So are we going to see deep discounts in pricing as companies that are desperate for cash flow try to secure business? Or are we going to see a bit more discipline where companies realize, okay, it will return to normal after a while, and by holding on to current pricing, they can protect their margins to some extent. And I guess the answer is that in some countries that will happen, and in other countries we'll see these big discounts. We've seen discounts already in export markets. So I think that for countries that typically have imports, then that's going to be something of a pressure. On the other side, there's also this, which we say, a suspicion of extended supply chains. And so obviously this is probably most true of medical supplies and perhaps food security, but I think it applies to basic products like cement as well. So countries that perhaps in the past have imported cement might ask again whether that's really the right thing to do, or whether they should be encouraging local industry to produce enough, at least for the basic needs. So how that pans out remains to be seen, but there's certainly some countries where that is a topic for discussion. Possibly including South Africa.
That's something that we've heard from a few others, is that this issue of supply chain and also getting supplies in time has been quite challenging. Yes,
I think that's right. And I think where there's been an experience of supply chain interruption, then you probably have a higher likelihood of action being taken to secure local supplies.
Yeah, exactly.
I think if we look more generally, then one of the key challenges the industry faces, which COVID hasn't really changed, is the oversupply that we can see in almost all markets around the world. It's more serious in some places, and the potential future growth is very different in different markets. So in India and sub-Saharan Africa, we can see a substantial potential for growth over the next 10 years. Whereas in many markets, there's more likely to be a stable or even a declining demand.
That was actually my second question to you, were kind of these the macroeconomic challenges. So the overcapacity is definitely something that has been raised a number of times. Are there any other, I suppose, challenges that COVID didn't necessarily exacerbate, that were already there and will still continue to be challenges?
Well, there's the thing that goes along with overcapacity very often is a poor market structure. I mean, it's quite common that a poor market structure has led to overcapacity. In other words, you have a lot of new entrants, and perhaps new entrants without a lot of experience of cement or other heavy industry that enter the market opportunistically where there's some peak demand, and then you wind up with a capacity that's a significant overcapacity. So I think even when we look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where the potential for growth is very significant, many countries have very fragmented supply, so profitability is still under a great deal of pressure. Yeah. And in fact, you can see that markets where the growth rate's very high typically attract new entrants much more than markets where the demand is flat. So even though you would expect that growing demand is a good thing, sometimes it turns out not to be. Sometimes it turns out to be a real challenge to earn a return when you have a lot of new entrants coming in. So I think market structure, in the growing markets in particular, and whether that leads to a restructuring that will make the industry more profitable longer term is a challenge. And I think we should also connect this to the pressures that the industry is under increasingly from the need to mitigate climate change. So this is something that we've known about for many years. I mean, this goes back to CSI being formed 20 odd years ago. But the pressure that the industry and the whole economy is under to reduce CO2 emissions is clearly growing. There's a growing awareness across the world that this is a problem. We see more companies making commitments about achieving zero carbon. And of course, we had the commitment from China that the whole economy will be zero carbon by 2060, which is really a very significant step, not only because China's the largest emitter, but I think, outside Europe, I don't think we've seen commitments on achieving zero carbon. So what happens in America, obviously, is a little bit of a question mark at the moment. I'm sure it will get clearer in the next month or two. But having China commit to zero carbon will have a big impact on the way that carbon mitigation progresses. And of course, the cement industry in China represents over half of global supply. So what happens in China makes a big impact on the rest of the world. And also, China is in the same boat as everyone else in that we know how to reduce emissions by a third, let's say, but we don't know how to do the other 2/3. We need new technologies to complete that decarbonization process. So if China has set the target of zero emissions, then the cement industry in China has a lot of technical resources, and I think we'll see more of those focused on this issue and of how to fully decarbonize the cement industry. So I think that will have implications in terms of how companies react to that. If we have solutions to eliminating CO2 emissions, then these will need to be implemented around the world. Once it's possible, then I'm sure we'll come under more pressure to get it done and to get it done fairly quickly. So we've got, as I said, we've got the levers that we've had for many years, which are really efficiency, energy efficiency and AFR, and then reducing clinker factor. Typically, these also reduce costs. So it's in everybody's interest to go as quickly as possible on these. But then the future steps, we still don't know, but it's entirely possible that they might actually increase costs. And then there's a question of where that money is going to come from.
Exactly. So, I mean, even if in the long term, this is for the the greater good, it is still quite a tough challenge to navigate.
Yeah.
On the flip side of this, however, opportunities in the industry, what would you say are the 1 to 2 greatest opportunities for this industry?
Well, I think they're a little bit related to the topics we've talked about already.
Mm-hmm.
There's clearly geographical opportunities in terms of the markets that are going to grow. So India and sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Mm-hmm. And I think there are specific opportunities that maybe come with new products. And a good example of this is the Simpor investment in Ivory Coast, in a plant. So in the Ivory Coast, you have a shortage of limestone in the whole of West Africa. And typically clinker has been imported. So imported from Europe or Turkey or North Africa. And what Simpor have done is to build a metakaolin plant so that they mine kaolin locally and produce an LC3 product, so only 50% clinker. And this can compete with an OPC. So that's localizing production that previously was imported. So obviously reducing costs, also reducing foreign currency demand and changing the import-export balance. So I think there are some opportunities that new products like LC3 will bring to particularly areas that are short of limestone, but possibly other areas as well. And you can see also work being done to make other cementitious products or materials more effective so that they can be used in greater quantity. There are various technologies that people are looking at to upgrade fly ash so that can be used in greater quantities. So I think there are some specific product opportunities that will come in particular geographies.
Yeah, I'm going to flip the question around a little bit because I think the next question pertains to what you've just been talking about. I'm interested in regional factors that are affecting particularly Africa and the Middle East, whether they are opportunistic or whether they're challenges. Do you have any particular insight in that?
So I think that, Africa, probably we have to split into different zones, if you like, or different regions. Mm-hmm. So if we talk about Africa and the Middle East, then, that's particularly East Africa that's connected to the Middle East. Yeah. And I suppose there's been quite a lot of import of clinker and cement from the Middle East into East African countries. Mm-hmm. I think, one of the questions is whether that will change, whether we'll see more local production satisfying demand in those East African countries and a reduction in imports. Yeah. It's a little bit of policy question for these countries, because if you think about, degree of oversupply that we have in the Middle East, clearly clinker is going to be available at pretty low prices from either the Gulf or from Pakistan. And if countries don't have policies that promote local production, then perhaps the imports will continue to be the most economic way to satisfy demand. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see in that area to what extent governments in East Africa want to promote local production of cement. Yeah. And to encourage companies to build clinker plants rather than import it. Yeah. I think in West Africa, as I mentioned, the LC3 development there by Simpor in Ivory Coast, I think this is something that is being looked at in other countries as well. And where you have a region that is short of limestone, this seems a good opportunity. So I think unless anybody discovers some new limestone, it's likely that clinker is going to continue to be imported there. Yeah. And with the low international price of clinker likely to continue, then that's probably going to make sense. But if you can localize a portion of production by producing cementitious materials locally, then that would seem to be an opportunity for those markets. Yes, interesting. So I think those are probably the two areas where we can see some change. Yeah.
And then I think I'd be interested to understand your perspective on the adoption of technology as we move to the fourth industrial revolution. particularly in Africa and Middle East, but around the world as well in the industry?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. It's getting to this stage, where this is really a big topic with cement companies around the world, and certainly something that we've been spending a bit of time on recently. So I think there are several types of technology that are quite interesting. So if we focus primarily on the plant, of course, when we talk about digitalization and AI, we could look more widely than that. We start to see AI having an impact in management and HR and so on. But if we just look at the plant side of it, then I think there's a suite, if you like, a suite of things that we can do, which is around online or remote condition monitoring and remote servicing, including commissioning services, which have become something of a necessity during the COVID period, but actually have worked pretty well. I think I've talked to a number of people who either have provided or used these remote commissioning services or remote support services, and I think universally they've been very happy with them. So I think that this is something we will see continue after COVID. And then we could also using the same technology, you can have daily and monthly maintenance inspections. And then also, of course, there's other technologies that are used on inspections, including CCTV and drones and so forth. So I think there's that whole side of things of remote support. And then there's another side which is really about how process control works. So you've got the application of AI and machine learning to the whole cement plant control, and there are companies that have implemented complete systems there and seen significant improvements in the variability of the process, which has allowed them to achieve savings in materials and improve productivity, which is not huge, but is perhaps 2 to 4% on materials and perhaps 5% or more on productivity. Yeah. So these are worth having, and the amount of investment that's required is not so huge. The other thing that's quite an interesting question is the future control room, and whether or not we'll see a controlling of multiple plants from a single control center. Yeah. So the technology to do that is certainly there already, but the main concern is about how vulnerable that is to cyber attacks. So I think this will take some time to come in before people are really comfortable with that. But potentially it gives multi-plant companies some advantage, because they can control several plants from a single control center. Yeah. And then they have the benefit of machine learning and so forth over several plants, as well as being able to have, what should we say, higher level experts who are looking after a number of plants at once. So potentially that could see, some improvement or some gap between the efficiencies of the single plant companies and the multi-plant companies.
That's very interesting. I have heard the adoption of the technology around a centralized control room, but I hadn't heard about the potential for cyber attacks. So that's definitely something that would need to be considered.
Yeah, I think this is something that impacts all of the IoT transformations, and no matter what the industry is. But clearly, if you can't be confident in keeping the plant free from cyber attacks, then I think you'd be quite reluctant to have a system which allows remote control of the plant. So a lot of the systems at the moment have remote monitoring of plants, but not remote control.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so if you don't have the remote control, then your vulnerability to cyber attacks is much less.
Yes.
But if you wanted to go to remote control, you really have to be quite confident that you have a strong security system.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the interview today. I thank you very much, Ian Riley from the World Cement Association. It was great to have you. And we look forward to the next episode of the Captains of Cement and Concrete Leader series.